Good morning. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started here. I'm Kelly Bourne, Executive Director of the Cyber Policy Center here at Stanford University. And today we are having a conversation about the impact of our digital technologies on our economy and society, the rise of e-commerce, the massive amounts of data that online retailers are collecting about consumers, and how their algorithms are using that data, and the risks and opportunities that poses for society. To inform that conversation, I'm joined by Ramsey Woodcock at the University of Kentucky Law, Krista Wilson from Northeastern University's School of Computer Science, and Julia Angwin, who is an investigative journalist and co-founder and editor-in-chief of The Markup, which is, I think, one of the first news outlets staffed with quantitative journalists really investigating how technology is changing our society. And before that, Julia was a senior reporter at ProPublica, where I first came to know her, and then spent a decade as a staff reporter at the Wall Street Journal before that. So I think this is going to be an interesting conversation. I'm really grateful to all of our panelists and attendees for joining today. I think really appreciating that it's hard to think about anything else but the pandemic and the unrest that we are experiencing across the country right now. And at the same time, really cognizant that these questions about how digital technologies are impacting our economies and societies are critically important, and even more important, I think, right now, as so many of us have moved towards e-commerce during the pandemic. So I'm really grateful for everyone making the time in spite of everything that is going on right now. Real quickly, before we jump in, a little bit of background about the Cyber Policy Center for those who aren't familiar. Our research and teaching focuses on the governance of digital technology and questions around how these technologies impact democracy, security, and geopolitics. All of our work is really intended to inform the policy agendas of governments, tech companies, civil society leaders, and academics globally. And we've been hosting these conversations with thought leaders in this space every other Wednesday at 10 a.m. PST. As I've noted in the past, most of these conversations have been around the impact of digital technologies on security, geopolitics, and democracy. So this look today at how digital technologies are impacting economies and society is a little bit different than what we've looked at in the last few months. And so thought I would really quickly ground us in 4 or 5 basic facts. 8 in 10 Americans now shop online. The latest data pre the pandemic was that e-commerce sales represented about 10% of global retail sales, and estimates suggested that 95% of shopping will be online by 2040. I can only imagine that estimate is accelerated under COVID. But global e-commerce was at $3.5 trillion in 2019, expected to go to $4 trillion and perhaps more this year. And the last couple of thoughts to sort of orient us, that Amazon obviously remains the largest retailer with 50%, online retailer with 50% of the US e-commerce market. But of course, we're all relying on Instacart. We were all using Uber. Each of these platforms have really different pricing models and strategies. So I think really understanding those will be helpful to all of us. So for today, I want to turn first to Julia. And Julia would ask you to take 5 or 10 minutes and just paint the big picture for us around how dynamic pricing works, what you think of the benefits and the risks are to consumers, society. And then Ramsey would love to turn to you to speak to your research, and in particular around questions about the equity, safety, and legality of dynamic pricing. And then Krista would love to turn to you to help us sort of unpack the black box that is the Amazon fulfillment algorithm, and to walk us through what researchers have learned about the strategies that sellers and Amazon employ. And then we'll save 30 minutes or so for Q&A if folks just want to go ahead and enter questions into the chat box. So with that, I will stop, and Julia, ask you to chime in.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just get my presentation loaded up here. So can you all see it? Great. So thank you so much for having me here to talk about this. This is possibly my favorite topic of all time. I've been a tech reporter for many decades. And one of the things that I think I first realized covering the internet and technology and e-commerce was that we were entering an era that's really unprecedented in the ability for retailers to set prices individually, right? So when you go into a store, it's really difficult for the store owner to change the price on you. There's definitely flea markets where you can haggle or whatever, but the internet is the first time that there's like this ability for what I call the mass customization of pricing. Basically, the technology exists and makes it fairly easy for a company to change the price based on any factor it wants, whether they know you shopped there before and they want to charge you more, or they actually just have decided that certain times of day things are going to cost different prices. So I want to walk you through sort of what is known about what amount of customization has happened so far. So the first really big story about customization of prices was in 2000 in computer world. A reporter noticed that at the Planet of the Apes DVD was different prices for different users at the same time. And Amazon at that time said it was just a test that they were running. And then after there was a backlash, they actually said, we won't do this anymore, because people felt it was unfair that why would the price of this DVD be different for different people at the same time, right? We have this idea, based on airline pricing that like, if you're all looking at it at the same time, you should all get the same price. The reward should be for the person who kind of got there in line first, not for just some other characteristic of your behavior. Many years later, when I was at the Wall Street Journal, I led an investigative team, and we did this story about Staples. Staples was showing different prices for almost all of its items, from staplers to big office furniture, and it was based on your zip code. So wherever your computer was accessing their website from was where they were making a different price for it. And what was really weird about it was that it turned out that it seemed to be based on the distance that you were at from their competitor's store. So like basically if you lived near an Office Max or an Office Depot, they would give you a cheaper price based on sort of the thinking that you might otherwise get up from your computer and run out to the store and buy something. Well, but the thing that was weird about that was that, first of all, that's maybe not how you would shop. You might not just be choosing between getting up from your computer and going to the store, but also that the communities that lived closer to those stores were actually more affluent and more white. And so essentially they were giving discounts to whiter and richer communities, which may or may not have been their intention, but it was definitely a surprising result. And just as a note, it is totally legal to do this, so they didn't change their algorithm after we wrote about it, and we're perfectly happy to defend it. Years later at ProPublica, my team, we found that Princeton Review was doing a similar thing with online tutoring. You had to enter your zip code to get a price, even though it was an online tutoring package, and the prices varied by zip code. And when we joined that data with census data, we saw that areas with higher Asian populations were much more likely to get a higher price. Princeton Review defended their pricing, said that there were lots of reasons why they would want to charge different amounts in different places, and basically continued doing it. So once again, it was a disparity that people who were shopping there didn't know about, but that was secretly taking place. A different kind of pricing than the ones I've just described is Amazon's pricing. So Amazon's pricing, as most of you know, since they have 50% of the market, almost everybody has probably shopped there, it changes by time. So every basically 15 minutes, the price on an item can change, and the vendor who's selling it. And that's because behind the scenes, there's sort of a back-end auction going on where different vendors are trying to become the default seller of that item. So they're all bidding against each other to see who can win what they call the buy box, which is where when you click add to cart, it's the vendor whose product shows up there. And Krista will talk much more in depth about Amazon, but I will just say that like we did an analysis to see was the vendor who won that little auction every 15 minutes always the cheapest price, and it was not. In fact, it was often Amazon itself or an Amazon partner who had a higher price that would be the default buyer. And it was in contrast to what Jeff Bezos had always said from the beginning, which was that we'll put anyone in that buy box. We want to give you the cheapest price. But in reality, most of the time they're defaulting to themselves or to a partner who pays the fees. Recently, as you may know, those dynamic pricing on Amazon has really gotten extreme, right? During COVID, there was really high prices, right? We wrote at The Markup, the new nonprofit that I just founded, and we just started publishing in February, in case you haven't heard of us. We wrote about a bag of rice that went up to $60 on Amazon, and the dynamic pricing is part of it, right? There's like everyone's trying to buy rice because they're trying to stock up for COVID, and their pricing algorithm. Christo can talk more in depth about this. He's done great research, but basically it encourages competition and encourages the prices to float higher than they would maybe without those algorithms competing. So, and I want to say one more thing about algorithms, which is that like it's not just online. So one of our first investigations of algorithmic pricing at The Markup was actually about car insurance pricing. Allstate has taken a page from online vendors, and they have this secret algorithm that actually provides different prices for each policyholder based on their individual characteristics. And so I think that this sort of individualized mass customization of pricing is actually spreading from online to offline. And so it's something that I think is really important for the public to understand, but it's really difficult to uncover. Basically every one of those investigations that I was involved in on algorithmic pricing took at least 6 months and teams of programmers. And because you basically have to pretend to be many different users simultaneously in order to see how they're all getting different prices at the same time. And so it's a really important topic, but it's one that we probably know very little about. I expect that what I've shown is probably just the tip of the iceberg of what's going on, but we don't know because it takes so much work to find out. And I think it's a challenge because the stakes are really high for the public. If we're all getting price gouged, that is something we need to know about. And there probably need to be more tools for investigations and regulators to determine when this is happening. So thank you, and I'll look forward to hearing from my colleagues.
Julia, thanks so much. That was really, really helpful. Ramsey, you want to jump in now?
Yeah, thanks very much, Kelly. It's great to be here. So I'd like to distinguish between, we've got all this sort of technology and data-driven pricing that's proliferating across the economy. I like to distinguish between personalized pricing or attempts to personalize pricing and dynamic pricing. So in this schema, attempts to personalize pricing revolve around the use of sort of data or past information about demand or about consumers to vary prices, sometimes on an individualized level or based on location or zip code, as Julia was talking about. And then the other type of data-driven pricing is dynamic pricing, which is when a firm incorporates new information about the nature of demand to vary prices. While personalized pricing is still, I think, really in its infancy, dynamic pricing, in the sense of incorporating new information and using that to raise or lower price, has really taken off over the last 10 years. And Amazon has certainly been a pioneer of that. Dynamic pricing poses some unusually bad problems, I think, for consumers. When it's used to lower prices or it's used to respond to shortfalls in demand, can actually be a good thing. A company produces a certain amount of inventory, price is lower than, demand is lower than it expected. Now it needs to cover costs on an excess of production. Maybe it needs to raise price, and dynamic pricing will allow it to do that. But the area of concern is when demand actually exceeds the expectations of the firm. In that case, there's only one thing that the firm's going to do with dynamic pricing, and that is to raise prices. There's more people are demanding the product than inventory that's actually on hand. And so effectively, the firm finds itself in the position of having to ration access to that good. Now, before dynamic pricing, before the rise of technology in this space, firms had no choice. They would just have to sell out, right? And that's something that I call queue-based pricing. That is, you keep the price where it was initially, which would have been designed to cover your cost of production because you wouldn't have planned to go to market without charging a price that's sufficient to do that. So you keep price, where it always was, and the good simply sells out, and you're basically rationing based on a principle of first come, first served. But what digital technology has allowed firms to do now is to raise price in response to that surge in demand. And so that amounts to rationing based on price. And that raises some important questions of equity, because when you're rationing based on price, that's rationing based on the willingness of a consumer to pay. And as we all know, often your willingness to pay is determined by your ability to pay. So you're deciding which consumers should buy this product, all of whom can pay the cost of production. They all would have been able to buy at the original price, but that original price now has an excess of demand. So you have to decide who gets, and you're deciding who gets based on, effectively based on ability to pay. The COVID crisis, I think, has really, made consumers aware of how dynamic pricing now has this rationing function, because consumers are seeing that when they go online to Amazon to buy PPE or to buy basic food items, they're facing very high prices. Julia has been developing in her work, and the question is it equitable during a time of crisis to have these dynamic pricing algorithms effectively rationing based on ability to pay? There's a second aspect to this that I think is also very concerning, which is, although we do have some movement of dynamic pricing from the online space to the brick and mortar space, brick and mortar still remains largely a sphere that's immune to dynamic pricing, at least in the short run. Prices aren't digitized in most of the stores that we go to shop in. And so if you want to avoid the dynamic pricing, if you don't have that ability to pay, you have to go to a brick and mortar store. And we now, in this environment today, going to a brick and mortar store involves a risk, right? A risk of infection. So this problem of dynamic pricing, I think, is particularly acute in the COVID pandemic.
Ramsey, thanks so much. That context was really helpful, especially that distinction between dynamic and personalized pricing and how this has evolved. Christo, would love to now turn to you to get sort of a look under the hood on Amazon in particular, and I think maybe you've been doing some work around Uber also. So yeah, curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, thanks, Kelly, and thanks for having me. This is going to be fascinating. So let me just pop up slides. Swap those out. That look okay to everybody? Fantastic. So I'm Christo Wilson. I'm an associate professor of computer science at Northeastern University in Boston. So I wear a number of hats as a researcher, looking at things like online security and privacy. But one of my big areas of research is something that I call algorithm auditing. And this is something that Julia is very much engaged in as well. It's this idea that we're now surrounded by these online algorithms. We don't understand them, but they have a huge impact on our life. So it behooves us to try and figure out what these things are and how they work, so we can at least have a discussion about what's going on. Part of this work is really focused on data. What data is being collected about us? How is it being shared? How is it being sold? Data brokers. And then the other facet is, how is that data used? So this is really about reverse engineering algorithms to see how are they using that data, and how does that actually impact us as individuals in a society? So I can give you a little bit of a flavor for some of the work we've done in the past, really trying to increase the transparency around these systems, and in doing so, increase accountability. Kelly mentioned we've done work on ride sharing. We were very interested in how Uber and Lyft had implemented dynamic pricing through surge pricing. There's these rumors around these systems that they're gouging you, and we wanted to know if that was true or not. So we actually went and made hundreds of fake riders and used that to collect data from these apps so that we could look at the extant supply and demand of vehicles and how that correlated then to pricing. And this was really fascinating because it actually seems like the algorithms were responsive to supply and demand. But there were strange things, like Uber had a bug where they were sending people incorrect prices for 7 months until we told them. Right? They never would have known if someone hadn't independently audited their system. And this was also interesting because it led to a collaboration with the San Francisco County Transportation Authority to study the impact of ride sharing in San Francisco, which is really important because the companies don't make this kind of data available to transportation planners. Another area of our work is looking at bias and discrimination. So we've done a lot of work on things like gig economy marketplaces, and whether minorities are at any sort of systematic disadvantage in these markets. And if so, do the algorithms play a role? So for example, on TaskRabbit, we saw that the feedback that workers were getting was often biased, right? Especially like African-American women, they just got worse feedback than other workers. In turn, the search algorithm relied on the feedback to sort people, right? So you say, I need a dog walker, and they show you the available workers. Well, minorities were being systematically ranked lower because of that worse feedback. So you have a social problem of people having bias that then impacts this system and then compounds this negative social consequence. We've done some work looking at personalized pricing, as Julia mentioned, looking at online retail and online travel. And what we saw was, the travel industry was much farther ahead along the curve here. So doing things like changing prices for individuals based on their prior behavior, or changing the way that that information was being presented. So there's this famous case from several years ago where Orbitz, if you went to their website and searched from a PC, they put the cheap items at the top of the page. But if you went and did the same travel search from a Mac, they would put the most expensive things at the top of the page, based on this notion that, oh, well, you have a Mac, so you must be affluent. Clearly you want to stay at the Ritz-Carlton. And we saw similar practices when we looked at travel sites. But today, my focus is really going to be on Amazon. So a couple of years ago, we did this study looking at dynamic pricing on Amazon. So we wanted to understand whether sellers were using algorithms to dynamically adjust their prices over time. So we collected data from around 1,000 of the top-selling products on Amazon at the time that was distributed kind of across product categories. And indeed, we saw a lot of dynamic pricing. So there were roughly 900 sellers, and around 700 of the products we looked at included at least one seller who was using dynamic pricing. And I should mention that we used a pretty conservative methodology to identify bots that were changing prices. So for example, if there was a product and only one person was offering it, we can't say one way or another whether there's a bot because there's no baseline for comparison. So what I'm showing here are two cases where we saw some algorithmic pricing. So on the x-axis here is time, y-axis is the price of the item, and every line is a different seller. So in both of the different plots, the seller in red is using dynamic pricing, and you can see some of the hallmarks of this. The seller in red has these massive changes that are sort of instantaneous in time, and those happen when other people in the market exit or enter. So in the graph on the left, for example, there's a moment in time when the purple seller leaves, and then there's this massive change where the price goes up when they balance themselves against now this black seller who's entered the market. There's also that interesting feature where red and purple are competing, and you can see the price going slowly down over time as their pricing bots kind of feel each other out to find the new floor for the item's price. I'll show you two more examples. So in this case, the red seller is using an algorithm, and the red seller is Amazon. So this is a case where Amazon itself offers the item. And again, you see the hallmarks of automatic adjustment here. Very quick changes as sellers enter and exit the market, and also these sort of hill climbing areas where people are feeling each other out. The graph on the bottom left is particularly interesting because you see that Amazon is pegging itself above the other seller's price, right? Their bot is intentionally choosing a price that is higher. So you might be wondering, well, why would they do that, right? Shouldn't these bots be choosing prices that are lower when they're competing? To understand that, you have to get into how Amazon's marketplace is structured around the buy box. So this is something that Julia mentioned earlier. When you're looking at a product on Amazon, this buy box is the thing on the right. It has the price, it has the add it to your cart button, and it tells you who's offering the item for sale. What people don't typically engage with is this other tinier box just below it that says, hey, this product is also being sold by other people at other prices, right? That information is there for you, but the default is not to use it, and it's sort of de-emphasized. We know that people don't actually look, right? They just click the buy button in the buy box. So there's an algorithm that determines amongst those available sellers, which of them is going to be in the buy box and actually make the sales. So this is a very high stakes algorithm. If you're selected to be in the buy box, you capture all the sales of that product. If you're not selected, you're essentially boxed out. So you would think that the most important feature for this algorithm would be price. And when we tried to reverse engineer it, we saw that that was true. Price is very important, but it's not the only feature that mattered. For example, if you use Amazon's fulfillment service, which means you can offer prime shipping, you're an advantage, right? Those are also people who are, for the most part, paying fees to Amazon to be part of FBA. But there's other things that matter, like the ratings and the feedback on the seller. Right? A seller with more feedback, with better feedback, is at a distinct advantage over another seller offering the same price or even a lower price. So when we were looking at how this impacts the market, as Julia saw in her work, a lot of times the person in the buy box is not offering the lowest price, right? It can just be someone who has a lot of feedback. Amazon, of course, has the most feedback and the most positive feedback. So when Amazon enters any product, they pretty much own the buy box and box all of the other sellers out. So we'll get into the discussion, in a little bit, but just so my position on this is known, I think this dynamic pricing is adversarial to consumers. If you are if shopping for travel online makes you uncomfortable, if it feels adversarial, like you're getting ripped off, imagine if that was the way it was for all retail. That's what happens with high frequency dynamic pricing, and that's exacerbated in times of shortage. When the price of rice keeps going up, consumers are at a fundamental disadvantage against automated systems. Amazon's systems in particular are very much winner take all. Right? If you capture the buy box, that enables you to accrue more feedback, which then enables you to raise your price while also capturing the buy box, leading to this pernicious consequence of boxing everyone else out and causing the prices to go up. That's coupled with the fact that the design of the site itself discourages price exploration. Most people don't click on that tiny box to look at the other offers, and that's by design. This also raises potential issues of intentional and unintentional algorithmic collusion. You see the pricing bots competing against each other. Sometimes that causes prices to go down, but not always, right? So you can absolutely have essentially a cartel of pricing algorithms that push prices upward, which is not what you'd expect, probably anti-consumer, and again is exacerbated during times of panic buying.
Great. Thank you, Krista. That was extremely informative. And so now I want to go ahead and open it up to questions. And so would welcome folks to add things to the Q&A box. I have quite a few of my own that have been provoked by what you all just said. And so might jump in there. And I think, Krista, you made, I think, the point quite clear at the end that you have concerns about the sort of equity implications of some of this. And I'm curious, just sort of taking a step back inclusive of, but not focused only on pricing. Would love to hear what each of your biggest concerns are about the move to e-commerce. And I imagine part of it is price, but other concerns as well.
Well, I think the move to e-commerce is potentially a very good one if we're able to have rules for how that's structured that take off the sort of adversarial aspect with respect to consumers. So, for example, move to e-commerce enables dynamic pricing, which is clearly redistributive and has some not great social outcomes. But at the same time, look at this crisis. Being able to shop online, has made it possible for millions of people to reduce their exposure to risk. And also, we've seen these large e-commerce vendors impose some socially beneficial policies. So, for example, after initially being criticized, Amazon started to restrict access of Amazon buyers to PPE. Now, if you go to get certain kinds of N95 masks on Amazon, you have to write in and prove to them that you're actually a healthcare worker. And I think a lot of this is only really possible because we've got large centralized e-commerce companies that are able to sort of impose these blanket policies. So I think there's a good side associated with this as well as a bad side.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I guess building off of that, for each of you, I mean, Ramsey, your point is there are actually a lot of good possibilities here if the right policies are in place. If you all had, a wish list of one or two policies that you think would be appropriate to have applied to these platforms that would mitigate some of these equity concerns that you've raised while still retaining the benefits of the sort of ease and scale that we're seeing, do any policy dream lists come to mind?
My dream is always more transparency. If we're talking about like real world e-commerce, something like personalized pricing or price discrimination is accepted, right? We have coupons, we have senior discounts, and we're fine with that because it is transparent. The problem with the shift to online is now there's this information asymmetry where the market knows a lot more about you than you know about the market. We have to have some way to balance that back out to empower consumers and regulators, frankly.
And thank you for that. I mean, we've been doing a lot of work at the Cyber Policy Center around transparency, in particular of online content platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Google. When you think about the kind of transparency that you would like to see, what does that look like? Is that socio-demographic data paired with price data by item, or just tell me a little bit more about like what exactly we would be looking for?
I mean, for starters, I would just like to know things about how markets are constructed. So where are algorithms at play? What are the features in those systems? Was there any kind of equity analysis about the values underlying the design decisions of that system? And if so, how did they impact the final rollout? Is auditing happening? By whom? Just being able to look at the sort of broad contours would already tell us a lot. We don't have to have source code or anything that's super hyper granular to really further these discussions in a very positive way.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you. Oh, sorry, Ramsey, go ahead.
Sorry. Just to add to that, and I think that's exactly right. But sort of looking even further down the road. I mean, I think ultimately what's going on here is you've got these natural sort of network effects and economies of scale associated with online commerce, and so you're sort of naturally getting these large firms, running the show. But at the same time, technology is advancing to the point where, right, it's possible for firms to start setting prices, in multiple markets and basically structuring the market through pricing algorithms. And so at some point, we're going to end up in a world in which we have these very large private institutions that are essentially acting as central planners. And at that point, I think the question is going to be, do we want private organizations to be doing the central planning, or do we want government to be taking a role in that? And so I think you're seeing a little bit of that right now with the crisis, in the way that you have Amazon stepping up to decide to allocate certain types of goods to certain types of people. You have it deciding to put limits on dynamic pricing in some areas, but not in others. And so I think in the very long term, we're headed to a situation in which technology is making it possible for us to make decisions that markets were once needed to make in a much broader range of ways. And a lot of the data that we have now and in the future will have is going to allow us to make these sort of decisions with much greater specificity.
Can I jump in, or?
Yeah, please.
I guess I want to just add on to what you were saying, Ramsey, and then go back to your original question, Kelly. So it's interesting to see what's been going on with Amazon, because different governments have taken different approaches to dealing with shortages of supplies during the pandemic. And specifically, France is a pretty good example. They said that the risk for Amazon workers working in these warehouses was just too high to justify shipping anything other than essential goods. And so Amazon fought the ruling, but it's been upheld in court. And so in France, Amazon essentially shut down its warehouses and said it was complying with this ruling, but it just shifted all those shipments to its warehouses in Spain and nearby countries. So essentially, if you live in France, you can still get clown costumes and rubber chickens and all this. This is one of the stories we've done at the Markup, is like, where can you buy a rubber chicken from? It turns out basically anywhere in the world on Amazon, even though there are many countries that have said to Amazon, please restrict sales to essential items. So one point I just want to make is that these companies as large as Amazon are kind of unregulatable in a weird way, right? Not necessarily, it's not clear to me whether that would happen in the US, which is where their base is, but around the world, governments are struggling to regulate these technologies. In terms of like what kind of transparency we would want to see, I think that Europe also has an interesting model, although not perfectly executed, on algorithmic transparency in their in the GDPR, which basically says that you should be allowed sort of a right of explanation if an algorithm decides against you in an adverse way. What's interesting is that we in the US have one of the most robust actually laws in that regard with the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So if you get a credit score is essentially an algorithmic, outcome that determines a lot of things for people, right? Their ability to buy a house, to get a loan. And in 1970, Richard Nixon, that great transparency advocate, it signed into law the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which basically gave you due process rights. You can dispute the underlying data, and you're allowed, if you get an adverse ruling, essentially a bad credit score, the institution has to provide you with the ruling and the explanation, and you're allowed to dispute the underlying data. And so there is a model that we have for an explanation of an algorithm that could be applied in other ways in the US. I'm not a policymaker, so I don't want to write up like a draft plan, but I just wanted to point out that there are models out there.
Thank you, Julia. That's really helpful. I just have two follow-up questions and then want to turn to a number from the Q&A, but I'll start, Krista, first with you, since you went first. And I think your comments about transparency, and particularly about not needing to get into the source code, but needing to understand what are the goals that these algorithms are sort of working towards. Are they doing social impact analyses? Are particularly interesting in light of what we learned, I believe it was just last week, although time has sort of shifted weirdly as of late, but about Facebook having done all these analyses in 2016 and 2018 to try and understand the extent to which they were contributing to extremism, and found, I think it was 64% of extremist group joins were a function of their algorithm, and then did nothing. And so these interesting questions about, are companies performing these analyses to understand their social impact, and are those being shared transparently, I think really resonates. And on the transparency point, I want to come back to, I think, Julia, before we all jumped on the phone, we're talking about CFAA and challenges around investigating and just all the, challenges that are experienced because of this lack of transparency. So I'm wondering if either of you have comments about that. And then Ramsey, I would love to turn to you to talk about this sort of central planning question. And we have a question from the audience about is this a threat to the capitalist system? And if you are in a position now where Amazon could plan basically the economy based on all the information it has in a way that Russia wasn't able to do quite some time ago, what are the policies that we need to put in place or the concerns that we should have about that kind of market power? But Julia, challenges investigating and sort of transparency first.
Yeah, this is my favorite topic also. So for those of you who don't know, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is a law that criminalizes unauthorized access of one computer to another computer, which essentially means that the type of work that Christo and I do when we analyze an algorithm, which involves using automated programs to visit tons and tons of public web pages and collect that data, build a database from it, and analyze it, could be considered a violation of the terms of service of those websites, which then could be considered criminal. And so that is a huge legal liability to the type of research that is needed to investigate these algorithms. And Christo can speak to it, but he's a plaintiff in a case where that has actually led to some really great legal rulings about the fact that maybe this kind of behavior, when it's done by researchers and journalists in the public interest, should be allowed, but that is not agreed upon standard in all courts. That's just one circuit. And so it means that, like, for me, running a small nonprofit, I have to invest in an enormous amount of legal advice, and it's just honestly a real kind of existential threat to this type of work.
Thanks, Julia, for elaborating on that. And then Ramsey, or really for any of you, Russia couldn't really manage central planning across 11 time zones to figure out how much timber, all of their different areas needed. But you make this point that, maybe Amazon now has that capacity, and that there are some, and that they are also stepping in in a government-like role, around mass distribution and things like that. Concerns about how we manage that capacity?
Yeah, I think, well, so I should qualify my statement somewhat. So what dynamic pricing allows firms to do is to extract more of the surplus that's created by a transaction. You think of, there's a cost of production, and then the product confers a certain value on consumers, and the difference between that cost and the total value conferred is a surplus. What dynamic pricing allows firms to do isn't you can't completely plan the economy, but what they can do is they can determine how that surplus is distributed by raising prices above the level that normally, under the uniform pricing that happens without technology, wouldn't be possible for them to do. So you've got this. It's not a complete central planning power, but it is a power to influence markets in ways, or to influence market outcomes in ways that didn't exist before. And so it's not a threat to the capitalist system. I think, in the sense of, Soviet style deciding, how much rice, each person gets. But it does mean that firms have way more control over how wealth is distributed as a result of capitalist market transactions than in the past. And is this problematic? Yeah, I think it is. I mean, this question of the distribution of wealth is one that, obviously government is very interested in. And without some sort of government regulation, you're going to have a situation in which firms, use their new powers to extract all of the surplus for themselves. And that basically undermines a kind of, market-based settlement regarding the distribution of these surpluses that's prevailed, up until this point. So I think Christo's absolutely right when he says, look, there's an information asymmetry here, and so the relative bargaining powers of consumers and firms have been very much upset by the rise of this technology.
Great, thank you, Ramsey. Okay, so now turning to the Q&A, we have a lot of questions around airline flights. I'm thinking people are feeling really cooped up in their homes right now and thinking about when we're going to be able to travel again, because there are quite a few questions on this topic. How are airline flights determined? Comments about, if they're searching across multiple engines for a particular flight, it looks like maybe that search itself is influencing availability and ratcheting up the price. Questions about if Mondays really are the sweet time to buy an airline ticket. Can one of you just talk to us a little bit more about how airline pricing works?
The airline pricing is fascinating because there is a central clearinghouse of prices. There's a database called Sabre. It's been around since the 60s. And all the major airlines push all of their ticketing information into that central database. If you use a tool called ITA Matrix that was bought by Google many years ago, anyone can directly search Sabre to get kind of the true underlying price and availability of airline seats. So on one hand, that would suggest that there shouldn't be a lot of personalized pricing going on, right? If you go to Travelocity and they show you that the ticket is $800, but you go to Sabre and see that the ticket is $600, that means Travelocity has added that markup, right? Because you have the true underlying price. So it would seem, given that the raw data is there would be a disincentive to do some, additional shenanigans on top of it. But in practice, most people don't know that Sabre exists. It's not super easy to get access to it, right? You have to know about ITA Matrix. So there's plenty of opportunity to do personalized pricing. So if you care about airline price tickets, I would recommend don't go through a third party like Travelocity or Expedia, right? Just go directly to the airline itself. It seems like it would be harder for the airline itself to inflate a price just for you. Whereas the aggregators like Travelocity, in the past, when we've looked at hotels and rental cars, they absolutely will do personalized pricing. So then the other aspect is then the dynamic, right? Regardless of personalization, the prices are changing in time. And there's not a lot you can do about that because it's a market with, if you don't use the capacity, right, you lose it. So there's a lot of incentive to change things over time.
Okay, that is totally fascinating. And now, Christo, I'm wondering,
if I just piggyback for 1 second, Kelly, I just add that there's some encouraging signs about the dynamic pricing. So some companies seem to be trying to compete based on reputation for not engaging in some of that behavior. So for example, Walmart in its curbside pickup and grocery delivery has come out and said, we will not mark up grocery prices if you decide to do curbside pickup, which, if you use Instacart, is done all the time. So, we can hope at least that some firms, for competitive reasons, will give us alternatives. But in the airline context, I don't know.
Well, thank you guys. And that was totally fast. And now I'm sort of wondering, Christo, are you do normal humans have access to Sabre and the ITA Matrix? Like when you go airline ticket shopping, is that what you are doing?
Yeah, so anyone can use ITA Matrix search, right? Google just makes that available. Or they did the last time I checked. Maybe it's been folded into Google Flights now.
I think it's called Google Flight Search now, right? So basically when you see that box show up, that is basically logging you into Sabre.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So assuming that Google hasn't layered anything on top of it, it should still be direct Sabre access. That said, anyone can become a travel agent and get access to Sabre. There's a monthly fee. It's not that expensive. One of my colleagues does this.
Ooh, I want to do that.
Yeah.
Really
he sells all of us airline tickets. He makes a commission. When he gets stuck in an airport, he can directly change his own flights. It's like a superpower. It's incredible.
That is totally fascinating. Okay, and then the one other question that was related to this, and then we'll move on, is there a particular time, a day of week, time of day? Is that a rumor? Like everyone's heard flights are cheapest on Tuesdays or at whatever. Is this true?
I don't know if the day you buy matters as much as when you are flying, right? Everyone knows if you stay over a weekend, there's price discrimination going on between business travelers and leisure travelers. But I love these questions because it reveals this kind of folksonomy that grows up. You know, people see things they can't understand and they try desperately to search for an explanation. And I think the answer is we just don't know. And even if I did, the algorithms could change tomorrow and I wouldn't know anymore.
That so nicely underscores, coming back to the transparency point, just the massive challenge in researching in this field is that you do all this research and what's true today might not be true tomorrow or 6 hours from now, depending on how these algorithms change. Okay, so moving away from airline pricing, some questions about new industries to watch that you think will start using dynamic pricing that haven't yet. Is there something coming up that we should be concerned about?
I mean, I think Ramsey already mentioned one, the Instacarts of the world, the middlemen delivery operators. There's a lot of evidence already that they're adding markup all over the place. And if we talk about, someone like Uber, accusations that they look at things like the battery on your phone to decide you're desperate, now the prices go up. The opportunities for that are absolutely there.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the thing that makes it so hard, is that the stakes are so high, right? The idea, we're in such an economic painful situation as a country, and honestly, the opportunities to exploit vulnerable people have never been greater, right? And that is the thing, I think, just that is what worries me the most about all of this, because the ability to do it is there, and it's really just not that hard, right? There's a million vendors who will sell these retailers software to optimize the pain point. And look, the reality is, like, there's moments when I'm online shopping and I'll kind of will pay anything for rice. And so if they know that and they can exploit it, and there's no checks and balances, and there's no way they'll be caught, because for me to catch it, I would need to have 7 other people at that same moment shopping from different computers around the country. And then even then I wouldn't really know for sure, right? And this is the challenge for us at the market. We're always trying to design these experiments, and they involve setting up dozens of computers and accounts everywhere, and you still don't always get a definitive result.
Yeah. I really appreciate you underscoring that. I think at the end of the day, all of these questions about the governance of digital technologies come back to these questions of equity and fairness and exploitation. And so I guess sorry.
I'm in on that question. So the one thing I worry about is that I sort of want the government to ride to the rescue on this, but actually governments themselves seem to be getting in on the action. So, for example, New York City, recently, passed a plan to implement congestion pricing for people driving downtown, and part of that includes a dynamic pricing aspect. It hasn't been announced yet how they'll do that, but that's government using dynamic pricing as a kind of revenue generation measure. Okay, it's also got the decongestion aspect, but there's other ways to decongest, right, that don't involve charging higher prices. You could use technology in order to limit, access to downtown without using price as a way of rationing access. You see that with paid fast lanes on commuter highways as well. So that's what concerns me the most, actually.
No, that's quite right. You could have, I think Mexico did, based on your license plate, right? And that's a much more equitable way than price that has, much less likelihood to cause those kind of disparities we're concerned about. Okay, we have 5 minutes left. I have 2 very different questions, but ones that I'm really curious to hear your answers on. One about antitrust. Obviously the US has a really different sort of stance around antitrust than Europe does, much more price-based. You're seeing some of these sort of price exploitations. What are the implications of antitrust? Does it seem like antitrust is, and on the one hand, you can sort of see this sort of price extraction as a justification for antitrust law. On the other hand, there are some of the benefits that we see to this kind of scale that really serve consumers well. What do we think about antitrust in this context? And then a second question that's just around the role of ads in the digital economy. I mean, obviously, this is a massive industry. I think 70% of all digital ad dollars are spent on Google and Facebook and Amazon. There's this question around how much of a role are ads playing in informing people versus just manipulating people. And so I want to start with antitrust, but then tee up what's coming next. And we have 4 minutes, so it's like a lightning round.
Well, I'll kick that off just quickly. So, in Europe, you're right. There's been a long-standing rule that prohibits exploitative pricing. We don't have that as a general matter in antitrust in the United States, and that's I think the rise of dynamic and personalized pricing is going to drive a reckoning on that. As far as advertising. Digital advertising, I think the main thing to keep in antitrust, the main thing to keep in mind is that, advertising in the information age where we already have all the information we need about, what goods are out there for free. We don't need ads to get that information. Advertising now is purely manipulative. And that's actually an antitrust problem because it means that companies that don't necessarily have better products win the competition through manipulation. And so, that itself is a problem, but also should make us think twice about plans to break up, say, Google or Facebook, companies that engage in a lot of this digital advertising, because more competition means more output. So you get more of the bad if you have more competition. So, perversely, even though it is a competitive problem to have advertising, the conclusion might not necessarily be to break these big companies up.
Other thoughts on this before we close?
I think I would just say on advertising that advertising is sort of what led us to where we are, right? Advertisers were the first to do this mass customization, to do basically dynamic ad loading. So deciding that they set up these real-time bidding that automatically everyone bids on your arrival at the website. Their advertisers secretly behind the scenes are all trying to decide who gets to show you that ad. And that's actually almost exactly the model that led to Amazon's buy box. So it is a straight line from our decision to allow advertisers to track us across the internet, collect entire dossiers about us, and then trade on those dossiers to exploit us. And then just pricing is one step further from there.
I totally agree. I think antitrust needs to evolve beyond looking at price to look at information dominance. There's now credible accusations that Amazon uses data about their third-party sellers to then introduce competing white label products. Right? And that's an information problem, not a pricing issue, in the way it's classically framed. With respect to advertising, I am a hater of the whole industry. We did a study looking at the inferences that advertisers draw based on browsing history. We showed people the inferences that had been made and said, is it reasonable? And if you saw an ad based on this, what would you think about it? And it was basically a crapshoot. 50% of the inferences were wrong. So you have bottom-feeding exploitation, like hyper-targeted partisan ads. And then you have advertisers wasting a boatload of money on bunk data. And we're caught in the middle, giving all this data. It's either being used against us adversarially, or it's just wrong. So why are we even allowing the data to be collected if those are the outcomes? The whole thing is bankrupt, as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. I think on that, it makes me think of our colleague Zeynep Tufekci at UNC, who has often argued, why don't we just allow us to be the consumers instead of us being the products, and then we wouldn't have to be selling ads. We could just pay a couple of bucks a month and maybe have a really different information and financial ecosystem. So on that note, I just want to thank all of you so much for taking the time again, especially in the midst of everything that we're all grappling with right now. This has been extremely informative. And so really, really appreciate it. Want to turn now just to next steps to let everyone know that we will be having another webinar in a few weeks. The next one will be looking at patterns of and potential solutions to disinformation sharing under COVID, and we're going to have our colleague Josh Tucker at NYU, David Lazar at Northeastern, and Evelyn Dueck at Harvard speaking to both disinformation under COVID, and we're also going to touch on what we're seeing around the 2020 elections. So really looking forward to that conversation. And if anyone wants to join the mailing list and find out about other webinars or things like that, the information is at the bottom of the screen. But again, thank you everyone so much, and really lovely to see all of you. Take care.